In introducing today's keynote speaker, I'd like to begin with a quote. I thought about just starting with a quote, but you wouldn't know what I'm talking about. So, the cloud renders geography irrelevant until you realize that everything that matters, everything that means you don't die, is based not only on which passport you possess, but also on a complex web of definitions of what constitutes that passport. In the new battles over citizenship, those definitions are constantly under attack. That's James Bridle, London-based artist, writing in an artist op-ed for us last July on how the response to terrorism by some governments means a redefinition of the terms surrounding citizenship, including in the UK and elsewhere, full deprivation of citizenship for individuals with suspected links to terrorism. In the 10 months since he wrote that, Bridle has continued his examinations of the evolving nature of citizenship. And just yesterday, he launched a new project that continues exploring the relationship between citizenship and the cloud. Co-commissioned by The Space and created for South Bank Center's Web We Want Festival, Citizen X, available at citizen-ex.com, is a software that allows you to see your algorithmic citizenship. That is, it shows you all the places your browsing data passes through whenever you use the internet. That is, countries governed by laws, including some that might involve your data, and you don't know that you're passing through those locales. As the project website states, Citizen X calculates your algorithmic citizenship based on where you go online. Every site you visit is counted as evidence of your affiliation to a particular place and added to your constantly revised algorithmic citizenship. Because the internet is everywhere, you can go anywhere, but because the internet is real, this also has consequences. Citizen X is a timely example of the ways Bridle's work, which encompasses art making, criticism, and writing for outlets including The Guardian, Wired, Domus, and his own site, book2.org, engages with the contemporary. I use that term deliberately. At dinner last night with James, the term political art came up in relationship to his work, and it's not a term that he really prefers to use, but you can see why people do. He has addressed through his projects things like surveillance and technology, all the way to the U.S. covert drone program. One of his projects you may have heard of is called Dronestagram, and it basically simulates a drone's eye view, pairing Google Earth images of locations of verified drone strikes with news about those kills. To my mind, it's something of a disruptive technology because it's this place where the rest of us are putting photos of our dinner or our kids or our cats or our parties. And here he's reminding us of what our governments might be doing in these covert drone wars. He simply says he's responding to the world around him, the one we live in, through creative means, rather than dealing with political art. It's just the world we live in. It's just his sensibility that he uses in approaching this world. And that's what our next panel is about. Artists as Cultural First Responders is about how artists are using the internet and technology to respond to this moment through art, through writing, through platforms of other publications and institutions. I'm not sure that that's all what he's going to talk about in his keynote because he's doing double duty. He'll be on the following panel. He's also giving the keynote right now. And I welcome him to our stage. Thank you.
Hi. Hi. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for that invitation. Thank you very much to the Walker for bringing me all the way here. It's my first time at the Walker in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, and it's wonderful. And thank you all very much indeed for being here. Yeah, I'm not really going to talk about any of that, which is weird because it's exactly what I came here to talk about. But the last 6 months, year, I've been really focusing on my own work and just making stuff and putting it out there, which I'm very lucky enough to be able to do at this moment in time. And I haven't actually been writing too much about it or actually engaging with criticism outside my own work. But I'm both a bit bored of giving artist talks, even though I will do a bit of that. And also I kind of really wanted to respond to a lot of the stuff that's been discussed over the last 36 hours, which means I've basically been writing this on the fly. So it may be a bit all over the place. It's definitely going to be quite discursive. At times I felt like I'm just kind of live blogging the other other speakers, many of whom have been really excellent and fascinating. And I don't want to just repeat what they said, though parts of that will be unavoidable. And that's just enough apologies now. So I'm gonna get on with it. I'm, as you heard, a writer and an artist and a journalist and a number of other things. I feel like today I'm sort of mostly speaking as an artist because it gives you that permission to say some other things or to talk in a slightly different register. But I want to speak to my kind of peers, colleagues in criticism and journalism as well, because I think we're all in this together, essentially, to use a horribly Tory phrase. And I will try and avoid talking too much about. No, I'm gonna shut up and talk. Let's start with these. Has everybody seen these? Has anyone seen these? If you spend a lot of time on Google Maps, like I do, you may have encountered these things. You'll see them as images. You'll often see them kind of around the area of airports and stuff. They're planes in flight. But they're specifically captured in a particular way. I call them the rainbow planes. I'd found them as I was kind of hunting around Google Maps for various reasons. And then I kept finding more and more of them. I kept actively looking for them because I thought they were just extraordinary. I think they are beautiful and strange and emblematic of I'm not entirely sure what or I wasn't. But they spoke to me in some kind of way, and so I did what I usually do, which is just obsessively collect them and keep thinking about them, keep talking to them and trying to work out what on earth is going on here. And it took a while, and it ended up getting to it by various kind of roundabout routes, work I was doing around satellite imaging in other contexts and stuff. But ended up getting there. And what the rainbow plane is, it's an artifact of satellite mapping. It's a glitch. But like all true glitches, it's not just a mistake. It's kind of an opportunity to look through into the underlying systems that produce this image. Because it is a glimpse into. It's not a mistake. It is a fundamental result of the way in which this image is created and constructed. The rainbow plane is what happens is satellites don't have cameras on them, right? We're getting increasingly used to satellite imagery. It's kind of extraordinary. It's kind of amazing. You can take out your phone. You can see through satellites. You can scan the entire surface of the Earth's surface. It's like having a superpower. That's amazing. But we're not seeing photographs. That's not what you're looking at here. What you're looking at is an image constructed out of data. Satellites have a sensor on them that records radiation across the electromagnetic spectrum, and that extends beyond human vision as well, right? It's not just in the visible spectrum. They're recording the infrared and the ultraviolet as well. They're seeing in wider spectra than we are. And they record red, green, and blue separately when they make these data images. And when they reconstruct those images for humans to be able to view them, they overlay the red, green, and blue. And so occasionally you find within satellite images these artifacts which are produced by fast-moving objects, because the red, green, and blue have been kind of stuttered by the fact this plane is flying very, very fast indeed. And so when that image is constructed, it leaves this extraordinary kind of rainbow trace. But in that, you can see how the satellites see, right? It's a reconstruction of the world through the eyes of the machines. It's a moment at which we can see how technology has a way of seeing the world. But it's also, to me, kind of emblematic of something that we're trying to learn from it. Or something that the network is kind of trying to teach us, which is a new way of seeing alongside or through or within those technologies. So this is like John Berger again, right? We were there yesterday. And I want to pick up from where Ben Davis, or from what Ben Davis was saying about, because I think it's really important we figure out what's changed since these kind of statements were made. Berger made these statements 40 odd years ago. And even this, which is right there at the beginning of Ways of Seeing, from Ziege Vertel's film Man with the Movie Camera, was made 40 years before that. And he's already talking about this kind of machine vision. He's already trying to understand what's changed in this kind of human vision of the world and what it means for us. And so if we've got anything new to talk about here, at a conference which is entitled Arts, Journalism and Criticism in a Digital Age, then the key to that kind of has to be in the second half of the sentence, right? It has to be what's changed in those 40 years. And Berger was talking about the eye, mostly. He talks about the eye a lot. But I want to talk about networks and the difference in images, which is produced not just from their kind of distribution and assemblage, but out of their kind of very construction, and out of the way that construction is kind of shared now amongst many of us. Ben asked the not awkward question. He asked the question yesterday, like how many people have seen Ways of Seeing? She asked how many have read it. How many have seen the film? I'm just going to make you put up your hands because it's fun. Thank you. And there was that thing as well in that talk of, and in Burgess' thing of constantly looking really deeply into paintings and seeing the details and stuff. So how many of you, when you go to galleries, like really peer really closely at the surface of the paint, or like really pay that kind of close attention? Thank you. How many of you have viewed source on a web page? That's a good number. That's strong. And how many people write code? Still, that's a good number. That's really good. That's, I'll be honest, better than I was hoping for. Because I think these are kind of skills, and it's unfair, that last question. I'm biased towards it because I trained as a computer scientist, and it's kind of my default position. And there's a lot of noise around at the moment about kind of teaching everyone to code, and this will sort of magically save the world. Computer science kind of, and that approach breeds a certain myopia, I think. But it can be a useful myopia. It teaches you to break the world down into kind of structures and processes, into small discrete steps to make them understandable. And it turns out that kind of analysis is kind of useful to address other large and complex systems that we may find ourselves embedded in. I'm not sure that teaching everyone to code is the best solution. You shouldn't have to be a plumber in order to take a shit, right? Like, you shouldn't have to fully understand everything. But plumbers do have a general knowledge of kind of management of water resources that may perhaps be societally useful to us as well. And we should possibly pay attention to those fields of knowledge. Anyway, I want to go on a kind of a little Berger-esque wander, if you'll indulge me, which may or may not be useful. I want to introduce you to some friends of mine. I call them the render ghosts. You know them, right? They live in the unbuilt buildings all over town. You've seen them. I've been really fascinated by these images, these renders, these constructions for some time, for the role they play in the world, for the way they're constructed and consumed. For me, they've almost attained, particularly living in London, which is kind of overrun with this stuff, they've basically attained the position of a kind of public art and deserve the kind of attention that gets as well, as much as any of these kind of visual forms do. And I've been kind of studying them and trying to learn their techniques. And particularly, I've become kind of fascinated with the people in them as well. You watch them long enough and you see these kind of same people coming and going back and forth, going about their day and becoming familiar. And they're deeply weird, these images, right? They're supposed to be like the future, this place we're going to inhabit, but they're full of these very odd juxtapositions and strangeness, like the kind of potentially toxic plants, which are going to kind of fill up these privatized public spaces. The fact they've always got children playing in them, because as I say, they're sort of supposed to be about the future, even if it's not a future we are ever going to get to inhabit. And in fact, they're not going to inhabit either. They have to move out as soon as the buildings get built. They live in the relationship to the future in just as precarious a way as we do. Sometimes you can kind of catch them looking back out at you. Sometimes kind of hopefully, sometimes slightly more fearfully. You can even watch them despite everything falling in love. They spend a lot of time on balconies. They really love their balconies and they like to party up there. It seems to be very important to them. But a lot of the time, these images are also, as I say, kind of deeply revealing about the current state of the world. This is one of my favorite ones. This is just around the corner from my house in London, where they're happily building a new chain of designer outlet stores in one of the less salubrious parts of London. And in this render is overlaid on top of a real street. And this gentleman on the mobile phone in the pinstripe shirt is added onto the real image, as are the German luxury car and the four-wheel drive in the background. And just in the background, you can see an actual local slowly kind of being blurred out of existence by the overlaying of this stuff. They can also be kind of quite strange and interesting and beautiful. This is an image by a visualization studio I know called Pictureplane, which have become friends of mine, who've taken an incredibly detailed approach to this, even in fact using for example, in this image, the skies from 18th century landscape painting as the backdrop to their renders of these new housing developments in South London. I was so intrigued by Pictureplane's kind of method of working and the care and attention they seem to put into these things that I wanted to work with them, and I wanted to look at ways in which this particular approach to image making could also be possibly turned to other other uses. I worked with them to construct a series of spaces. And very specifically, I wanted to look at spaces which weren't made visible in other ways. The Dronestagram project, which you heard before, was very much a project of taking an event, an occurrence, a thing that was going on, the covert drone war, for which images were not available, and finding those images in another context and making them available to kind of fill in gaps in the imagery. When images are not provided in these circumstances, that lacuna is often and very revealing about the nature of the event. But of course, we have the technology to address that now. We can intervene in that kind of image-making process. I obtained planning documents from a number of sites that related to immigrant detention, judgment, and deportation in the UK. This is an airport outside London where people are deported in the middle of the night. It's actually a private jet terminal. So in the middle of the day, you have celebrities and business people flying out on their private jets, and in the middle of the night, it's used for deportation, but it's an entirely privatized space, and there's no way to take photos there. But plans are available at your local department office. This is a courtroom. This is the courtroom in central London, where special immigration appeals are heard. Again, it's a courtyard, and it's in a courtroom, and it's inside a court building, so no photographs of this space are available, but it's possible to sketch in there, which is what we did. And what's interesting to me about this is not just that it's possible to recreate this image, but it's actually possible to portray this architecture of what's occurring here. What's interesting about this particular court is that it's used for the provision of secret evidence. Secret evidence is a provision under UK law where evidence can be provided to the court without the defendant being allowed to know what evidence is being presented. A court-appointed mediator is allowed to see the evidence, but neither the defendant nor their defense team are allowed to access to it. And this form of secrecy actually takes a kind of form in the courtroom itself. It solidifies as architecture because you have this curtained-off witness box on one side. You actually have a partition here, which allows security service personnel to watch the court without being visible from the public area on the other side. So you have the infrastructure and the architecture of the place. But that is also, in fact, rendered visible and then made visible by us and the technologies. Likewise, you can represent various realities which we don't necessarily have access to, and in fact, whose representation is actively denied by power. This is that particular airport at night. This is the detention centre near Heathrow Airport where people are kept. The thing that's also odd here is that I think that I'm not representing the individual stories of detainees and migrants themselves, as important as those stories are, because what I'm trying to address is the kind of unaccountability and kind of ungraspable vastness of the system that produces this, which for me I have to talk about through kind of architecture and infrastructure. Because again, to me as a computer scientist, I see complex agglomerations of architecture and infrastructure, and I see the further complex systems of kind of laws and social processes that produce them. But through this kind of process of journalistic investigation, academic research, artistic impression, and the deployment of the new technologies, some possible way of seeing the world anew is made possible. Back to those figures, the render ghosts. Who are they? Where do they come from? Do they know they've been kind of rendered into the network in this way and digitized, distributed, and kind of spread around the world? I don't think they have, and so I wanted to tell them and find out. Through talking to architects a lot, I found these banks of images. These are a sample sheet for one of these collections of high-res imagery. In fact, one of the very first ones, because what I discovered was that for a long time there were only actually a couple of sets of these available. There was a particular set of a few hundred figures that had been shared around because the internet. Almost all kind of practicing architects, young architecture studios, architect students in various departments. And if you looked carefully, you saw the same people, like this suit guy, recurring endlessly and endlessly again around the streets. And I'd see them also all over the world. This is that same image set called Business People, brilliantly. See the bloke in the white suit at the bottom. Here he is visiting the Whitney. This was actually on the hoarding outside the Whitney Museum that I spotted him and his friend. I don't know if he's about to kind of throw himself off, but he's waiting for it. I said I wanted to know about these people and ask them questions and understand what was going on. So I set out to find them. There's a thing that... so I might just do some research about the origin of these images. This is rendersearch.com, which was not successful. But looking at the business records of this company, doing kind of tax record searches and stuff like this, I discovered that they were based in Albuquerque in New Mexico. So I started running Facebook ads, targeted Facebook ads against people who lived in this area, trying to locate them this way. I was also, trying to understand this company that produced them, because they weren't answering my calls, which I thought was rude. They did answer once, actually, and then they hung up on me. But they didn't answer their emails or anything like that. And so I went to Albuquerque, and there was no one at home. But I was there, so I was running like more local newspaper ads and trying to locate these people, putting up kind of signs, all of this kind of thing. I really have no idea what I'm doing by this point, right? Like this is where the obsession with the network takes you, as you dive kind of really deep into it to try and find this stuff. And what happened then was that I actually met a guy in a bar, as you do, who turned out to be a local investigative journalist, as you do, who had like a load of state tax records on his phone, as he did, apparently. And what he told me was, in fact, that this company had only formed in the state subsequent to the release of the images, and that they were not, in fact, from here at all, and that, as in fact everyone in New Mexico had been telling me since I arrived, these people are not from here. They don't look like New Mexicans. This is just all wrong in every way. Again, something that you kind of have to go down to the ground often to find out. And so I was in Albuquerque, where I'd never been before for this purpose, and I'd never seen that telly show, so I had no other kind of frame of reference to be there. I was thinking what to do. So I decided to take a couple of my favorite render ghosts on a road trip. And we went out into the desert. And I took them to Los Alamos, which seemed like a sensible place to go if you're trying to understand the internet, which is kind of essentially what I was trying to do. Right? This is what a huge amount of this kind of work has been about for me, is that I'm trying to build some kind of sensible and useful model of the internet that I can use. Right? We had that mention of the cloud earlier. The cloud being like this incredibly dangerous metaphor that kind of hides the operation of huge systems behind a kind of veil of like, you don't need to worry about this, it's completely fine, even though that you are engaged with it all the time, and it's not some kind of magical, distant, faraway place, but something that surrounds us totally at all times, and we're constantly accessing, and affects kind of every moment of our lives, apart from sleep, but they're trying to get in there too. So this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to understand the internet so that I can kind of operationalize that understanding and kind of use it. And Los Alamos seemed like a useful place to be as kind of one of the like historical birthing places of this kind of thing. It's not entirely true that the ARPANET was developed in response to the development of the bomb, but the connection between military technologies, between kind of Cold War and previous to that kind of aiming systems that developed the computer, the Cold War kind of development of these distributed networks, latterly things like kind of Xbox Connect and these very visional-based systems which all come out of warfare. They all kind of originate in this big bang at Los Alamos for me. So it seemed like a useful place to go. And of course you have kind of realizations going out into the desert like that, and you kind of figure out things. And what I figured out there was that what I was looking for was not actually a better description of the internet. Like going to a place like that is kind of completely pointless because the history isn't there, right? The history happened, and the history is all around us, and the history is something that has now become completely widely distributed over all of these things. The history of the bomb, and just like the kind of history of the internet. But I understood that I was understanding that as a metaphor through the internet. That my understanding of the internet actually allowed me to understand that, and so it became a process of kind of inverting that metaphor and thinking about how to use the internet to understand everything else. That actually I realized I'd been training myself as a computer scientist, as a person on the internet, to actually use that understanding and apply it to lots of other things. So, like, I was going to spend the rest of this talking a bit about criticism and the internet, which could go either way as well. 10 years ago, ish, over the last 10 years. In my capacity, another previous capacity, as a literary editor and a publisher, I was attending a lot of publishing conferences. We've all been there. We were all involved in a lot of the same kind of conversations that it feels like we've been having here about the changes that have been wrought by these technologies, and particularly by networks. And it strikes me then, and it strikes me again now, that this perceived crisis is not like some horrible visitation from the outside, right? It hasn't been forced upon us by kind of devious programmers, or even, in fact, largely by like large corporations that have definitely seized the ground now. But what it brings us to us is a kind of moment of clarity when we first perceive the ongoing catastrophe, for want of a better term, in which we've been existing all along. Like, take books. Take my favorite thing, and my favorite thing about books as they exist in the network. All those publishing conferences. There's less of this now, which is good. Thank goodness. But one of the big fears of like the early kind of predatory internet was doing to culture and destroying it was piracy, right? This horrible fear that something was being stolen from us, because it was really about that, right? I mean, underneath all this talk about like kind of lost revenue to publishers and all this kind of thing, the fear of piracy is a fear of loss of control. It's a loss of the kind of gatekeeper role. It's a loss of control of the text and the meaning that kind of comes from that, and the authority which stems from having control of that meaning. And it's very kind of fear of kind of an other control of the text in many ways. And this is my favorite example of that happening, right? These are 2 copies of a novel collected in Peru by my friend Andrea Frank, who runs a thing called the Piracy Project, which kind of collects wonderful examples of this stuff. And because of Peru's distance from the center of Spanish literary production, which is unsurprisingly still in Spain, there's a lot of piracy in that part of the world. And these are both pirate editions of a best-selling novel published in Spain, which therefore takes a huge amount of time to reach to these kind of ends of the supply chains, and so gets incredibly pirated because it's popular. These are both pirate versions of that novel, and they're also different pirate translations, right? The texts differ. Characters have different names in various places. Like the thing has, become unstable, and this is what happens. That piracy and that instability is what happens at the periphery, but the periphery is everywhere now. Like there's still centers of gravity and all that kind of stuff, but the network has shifted that relationship to some extent. But also critically and crucially, this is what happens to all texts, and what has always happened to all texts. All of them disintegrate and dispersed, are written and rewritten and overwritten and become the property of those who discover them, and are appropriated and reappropriated and misappropriated. Nobody has control of this process, and nobody has ever had control of that process. The difference that's been wrought by digital technology in this example is not that it's destabilized the text, but that it's revealed the text to have always been utterly and fundamentally unstable. And digital technology has actually given us a place to see that from and perceive it truly and properly for the first time. You see the same effect in online forms of knowledge production as well. Take Wikipedia. Take the fact that Wikipedia articles are assembled by these kind of agglomerations of professional and amateur writers. They contain all kinds of inaccuracies. They have biases that aren't, immediately obvious as well. Maybe not so much. They never ever conform to this kind of perceived neutral point of view that's supposed to be this kind of central standing and point of the encyclopedia. But like, so what, right? What the hell ever has? I don't believe that was ever the case. This is a printout I made many years ago of a single Wikipedia article, right? The changes, I printed out the change log of that article. So one of the brilliant things about Wikipedia is that you can see every edit that's ever been made to an article. And so actually, the difference in Wikipedia, and when you do that, you get a 12-volume set of books, which is the size of an old school single encyclopedia full of all that knowledge. And the difference is that Wikipedia is a visibly distributed system. Unlike those previous encyclopedias where they were self-contained and all that stuff, with the Wikipedia you can pull it apart, you can see its previous versions, you can run trace routes on the IP addresses of contributors, you can see when it's changed by someone who works for a corporation or who's an IP address within the House of Representatives around election time. you can see when that article was hastily compiled in response to a news event or something. You can see when it's been built up carefully over the time over many cited sources, all that kind of stuff. That stuff is now visible to us. And what's happened here again is not the invention of a new kind of encyclopedia, but a creation of something that is, if not totally, at least visibly and appreciably more democratized and accessible, not just in terms of its writers, but also in terms of its readers as well. And that's made, again, startlingly visible to us. And the construction of the web is also the construction of the discussions that we have on it. And even the fact that it's co-constructed by those technologies is visible to us as well. This is a list of the top 30 editors on the English Wikipedia. All the ones highlighted in yellow are bots, right? They're software systems. Like 20 of the top 30 Wikipedia editors, the ones that make the most edits, are software systems. They're automated little programs that go around Wikipedia, editing things, adding dates, correcting punctuation, all this kind of stuff. They're not making, I don't want to think I'm asserting that they're kind of making changes to the factual history of the world by doing this. But they are assisting us, and they're kind of working alongside us, and they are co-creating with us this representation of the world. But again, because of the way in which this is done, that is kind of visible to us. The other big thing that people are super upset about in the publishing world in the last decade has been like this idea of attention, right? The fact that people are, suddenly all tend to kind of jelly brains who aren't paying attention anymore. This one really annoys me. As if before the internet, like people were all perfect students who all sat there quietly and read the book from cover to cover. And again, this is bullshit, right? And we know it is from our own experience. But yet we kind of persist in kind of complaining about this as though it's something that's been produced by the technologies rather than something that's always been with us, that's been rendered incredibly clear to us. The internet didn't cause it; it revealed and potentially accelerated as well. But that's something that's emerging from our kind of own latent desires, it feels like to me. And this is, it should be said really clearly, not true just for attention, but for opinions as well. And I think this follows very much from what Aisha Siddiqui said earlier on, that the internet didn't create legions of misogynists and homophobes and racists. It just sort of turned over the rock and gave them a massive, horrifically amplified voice. It's like a naked lunch. You get to see everything at the end of the fork. And as depressing and distressing as that is, it also makes those attitudes visible and undeniable and potentially actionable in ways that they simply weren't before. I like this term used by the architectural theorist Keller Easterling, which is disposition. She says that technology has a disposition, that it is encoded with certain kind of beliefs and propensities to act in the world. But she also uses that disposition, uses that very careful analysis, the kind of politics of technology, to emphasize that it is something that we can construct and hedge around, that it is merely one kind of particular vector in the world, and that if we persist in believing that we are kind of hostage to the dispositions of those technologies, then we're just like, we're simply going to be acted upon by them, rather than kind of engaging with them. And a lot of the analysis that Easterling does is this kind of analysis, which Brian referenced earlier, I think, quite well in reference to the work of Trevor Paglen, which is also quite close to a lot of the work I do in this kind of materialist, Marxist analysis of the internet, which, traces these kind of paths. I don't think it's an entirely redundant analysis for a number of reasons, because it's not so remote and abstract now. None of this stuff is. It's not just about noting that these cable lines really exist, or the fact that they follow pretty much exactly the patterns of colonialism and connecting these nominally independent nations back to the sites of old imperial power. The presence of that information on the network makes it far, far more addressable, understandable. It's possible to link it more directly to what's happening in the world than was before. I kind of have to believe that, because otherwise we just have to kind of junk the last 50 years of technology, right? Learning about how images and data systems work and how networks actually function also, for me, permit forms of critique. These systems, regardless of who directly built them, not ignoring that, because it's important to know who they're built by and how, but understand they exist in the world, and that they're here to educate us, not merely to be opposed. We can choose what to learn from these metrics, right? The debates around kind of clickbait, negative reviews, the responses, the audience, those kind of stuff. We can choose what to learn from those results. We can redesign them to better suit our needs. We can also avoid them in ways that were not possible before. Like, we need these kind of examples in order to provide our counterexamples. And this visibility of systems, not necessarily of people, is incredibly important. I'm sorry to pick on Hyperallergic here, but after the discussion of ad networks yesterday, I kind of had to check on this. And it's really important to remember that this is the reality of the kind of funding and support models, funding and support networks, which we're discussing whenever we talk about how stuff gets paid for on the internet. They're predicated on surveillance networks. You can't have ad revenue on the internet without these kind of networks. And I think there's a direct parallel here to a kind of James C. Scott analysis of legibility when it comes to previous forms of institutional and state arts funding. Because we all know we've had to conform in certain ways in describing our work in order to receive certain fundings, or we've had to kind of present in certain accepted forms of art in order to get this. And this is just a more insidious form of that kind of conforming as a kind of surveillant body, as identifiable and trackable. And so on top of those networks, we build these other tools, other systems that make that surveillance and those actions visible in turn. Because something critical about these technologies is that they cut both ways. This power is not new, but it's no longer invisible. It has to be written down in order to be enacted by the machines. And the machines are not entirely out with our control, and this can be addressed in possibly new ways. And I think as we've been training ourselves kind of practically and experientially in how the network works, we've been teaching ourselves a mode of analysis that comes from the network. And it's increasingly impossible to ignore the kind of deep tectonic underpinnings of these structures. And it's precisely why we're capable of having discussions about things like whether it's zombie formalism or racial and gender representation. It's why we're talking about floundering materially, kind of short of money, short on self-esteem, because those things have been foregrounded by the actions of these technologies, and they're impossible to ignore. As the historian Tony Judt said in a very eloquent warning to non-historians and to those who said that history was over, he said, by ignoring history, you're like a person walking around an old house. You can pretend the rooms are empty, but you'll keep bumping into the furniture. You can't pretend ignorance about this stuff anymore. The same is true of the network and the reality it presents it to us. The network has kind of flattened out time. It's instantiated an addressable history, and it's here to teach us this stuff. But I kind of want to go further than that as well, I'm actually finishing, well ahead of time, that's good. I want to go further beyond that, just kind of like building up those kind of layers, because that's where I've got to, right? That's the kind of analysis I've been doing, and that's where I feel good about this kind of stuff, that it's possible to address these things and build on top of them and understand the technologies and therefore understand the world is the precepts of that, right? But I want to go further than that as well into what feels like uncharted territory, because I'm trying to figure it out. Because there are deep and serious problems with that approach as well, and which they underlie it, and they can be understood possibly through this framing of the network as well. Because it's not enough just to point at this stuff, right? It's not enough just to go, look, here are the lines on the map. It's not enough to point at pictures or images or aesthetics and their deployment and their material frameworks. You kind of have to go quite a lot deeper, I think, into the ontologies of the discussion itself, which are also being revealed. And as I say, in my own work, I'm kind of thoroughly guilty of this. In making the invisible visible has been like this kind of guiding principle of my work. This series of works, the drone shadows, illuminate a particular use of a technology, and they make visible its inherent visibility as well. That's kind of the idea. And it tries to raise questions about why that particular form of invisibility is so pervasive, not just in politics and the technologies of politics and warfare, but in the technologies that we use every day, right? The social technologies, the web technologies, the noumenal networks of the internet itself. The danger, again, as Aisha pointed out earlier, is that of mistaking visibility for power. It's a really good phrase that I'm stealing already, as you can note. Definitely has. Visibility without reconfiguring the underlying power structures is kind of just yelling, just showing off after a while, right? The difficulty, I'm starting to think, is that we've also fallen into a kind of trap about how we think about those oppositions. One that has a long history, but like all the other things, has been kind of accelerated, reinforced, and illuminated by the technologies. Because this discussion of visibility and invisibility doesn't just happen at the margins. It doesn't just happen in these contexts. It's happening at the kind of the height of international discourse and state conversations that are absolutely kind of the central issues of our time. Take the struggle that's occurring between state and non-state actors over information access and privacy. The central kind of insane paradox of the debate, illustrated by these two delightful logos, is this weird thing about how the NSA and WikiLeaks essentially share the same vision of the world, right? Both of them believe that there is some kind of central dark secret at the heart of the world that if we can only bring it to light, it will make magically everything better. This is like the ontology of big data. It's the bad lesson we're learning from the technologies. It's belief bounded on metrics and databases. That seems to align so closely with Enlightenment ideas about the just general increases of knowledge that it slips right through our critical defenses. But it's the bad lesson to learn. It's the wrong lesson. It's the opposite of the lesson of the confusion around piracy or around the kind of destabilization of text and knowledge that is what the network's actually trying to teach us. And it's weird that we are stuck within that. And a lot of the analysis of that has to come from analysis of power, I think, and how it's captured the ground of this discussion very, very successfully on both sides. And the problem occurs, I think, in art discussions and in art criticism as well. In particular, I think, in the need to kind of place artworks and events into a kind of discernible and authenticated lineage, to see everything in terms of histories and movements and manifestos, which for me are forms of sense-making that also have been largely discredited by the network, even in fact to admit the places to which criticism cannot or has no right to go if it's honest about its own position and capabilities. Visibility and transparency they're a baseline, but they're not the goal. They're an acknowledgement of the situation, but they're not like what we should always be striving for. And to quote Tony Judt again, I will, the job of the historian, or in this case the critic or many other roles, is to take tidy nonsense and make a mess of it. An accurate mess is far truer to life than elegant untruths. I want to finish with a few quotes on that line. André Breton in the Surrealist Manifesto, which I came across the other day, and struck by the full force of a statement made 100 years ago that we just really don't seem to have learned from at all. If in a cluster of grapes there are no two alike, why do you want me to describe this grape by the other, by all others? Our brains are addled by the incurable mania of wanting to make the unknown known, to make it classifiable. I'm not saying that surrealism is the answer now, merely noting that this sense is not new, and we can reach back more than 100 years to find arguments for it, engendered by not dissimilar technologically produced societal change. We just, as I say, don't seem to be very good at implementing it. And as a partial apology for quoting straight up two dead white men, I'll also like to quote Claude Cahun, who stated that realities disguised as symbols are, for me, new realities which are immeasurably preferable. I make an effort to take them at their word, to grasp, to carry out the diktat of images to the letter. Trust the evidence of your senses and your ideas. That's me, by the way. Trust the images and the sensations that you gain from the network because you have direct experience of this. Those things we were told about the authenticity is dying, or that the authority is not present in the network anymore, or that people don't pay attention and they're not thinking so widely and clearly anymore. Those aren't true, and we can deny them from our own experience. Stop bumping into the furniture, in short. The job of art, for me, is to disrupt and complicate, renew and criticize these networks by representing and building upon them. But the idea that visibility or making visible, figuratively or not, is a way of solving the world is troubling. Demanding that things cohere, make sense, fit into recognizable or even newly fashioned categories is a recipe for determinism, fakery, failure, and violence. The reason there's such an increase in discourses around representation right now is that they directly challenge this kind of revelatory process. The frame can't contain them and the center cannot hold. This is also the job of criticism. It has to make the same demands from the same position of understanding the material. I don't see how criticism can function without making the same level of demands and responding to the same challenges as art itself, in a form of solidarity, but also for its own survival. It needs to acknowledge both its place in the network and, like the network, its political position in reproducing and occasionally opposing this situation. It needs to account not for power, but for the fundamental uncertainties and instabilities of a world which is not radically new, which has always been with us, but which we can no longer ignore. Thank you very much. We can take questions. Hi. Are there any?
Your example of the airport that's used as both the celebrity and the detainee deportation center just made me think about privacy versus secrecy, and how there's a tension between those who are allowed privacy and then those for whom secrecy is used sort of as a weapon. Just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know how much I can talk about it, except to say that you're right. Those ideas of privacy and secrecy, they're not fixed things. They can't be kind of awarded like badges, and they can't be just kind of like purely constructed. They're negotiations, and they're positions that are negotiated from positions of power or otherwise, and so that they're always, they're always subject also to, I think, to our understanding of them on both levels. I think one of the really iniquitous things that's happening around kind of privacy online now is that it requires this kind of huge build-up of personal knowledge in order to achieve it for oneself, and if you don't have either the knowledge or the power to kind of buy it, so that you're kind of at an automatic disadvantage. But both of them also, privacy, essentially, is the right to privacy, the right to those things, is essentially the right to a freedom of action. That is not susceptible to other forms of power. That you can do the things that you want to do, and surveillance curtails that in all kinds of ways. So privacy is the thing that frees you from that. There's a reason those things are under attack. Right? There are structures that are deliberately attacking them, but those are not necessarily addressable to single actors, particularly in these kind of very large network systems. Because I get really careful when I say we built the internet, because it was largely constructed by white men in Southern California. But at the same time, there's uses of the network and the internet that, for me, speak to all of our desires. This is something that we, more generally than that, have built for us. That is trying to teach us something, that we're trying to understand, and if the actions that it's taking are offensive to us, are like aggressively attacking things like our privacy, then that's something that we've kind of that aligns with other desires. That means that. I'm expressing this terribly badly. That is a kind of fundamental result of some of the other things that we wanted out of this system in different ways, and it comes out of a not fully understanding that system at all levels. I don't know if that made any sense.
Hi, thanks. That was a great talk. You did not meet any of the render ghosts, is that right?
Nope, still haven't. I think they're in Vegas.
Oh, really? So
yeah.
Is this continuing?
I'm planning to get there at some point, yeah.
I know that it was something that you hadn't really figured out as you were doing it, but do you know what you will actually do with these people when you find them?
I want to ask them. Like, no, I'm slightly terrified of it, obviously, because it will get weird. But like, it's part of that trying to understand, right? It's just saying, like, what is your experience of this having happened to you? As you know, because at the moment they are unfairly and slightly sort of, aggressively sort of ciphers for me of like all of our experience. So I don't think it's going to be helpful necessarily to find them and ask them that. But there's, like many of these projects, the things that you find out on the way are somewhat valuable as well. But when I see them, I will simply ask them, like, did you know this was happening? Yeah. Do you know you've been to these places, and what does that mean?
I think there's an interesting hookup you've got with Eric Crosby here, if you get a chance to talk to him.
Okay.
He's got something interesting. The Walker has something interesting coming in a common direction there. But I want to ask you just simply, could you connect the dots between your training as a computer scientist and how you've ended up in the art world?
Yeah, sure. I took computer science kind of under duress. Because they don't let you study arts and sciences properly, like as dual things, at least in the UK. You kind of have to pick one of the two worlds, which is stupid and retrograde and ridiculous. But I was interested in the internet because it seemed to be the new exciting shiny thing, and it seemed to have some kind of meaningfulness. And I mistakenly thought you got to be on the internet by doing computer science, which turns out to be entirely wrong. I didn't do anything on the internet for 4 years. I studied artificial intelligence that turned out to be wrong as well. But by the time I'd finished that, I hated computers so much that I went to work in traditional book publishing, which is why I was at those publishing conferences. And it's why I was yelling at those publishing conferences, because it seemed that everyone there was also there because they hated computers and was afraid of the internet and seemed to see computers as being kind of, and the internet as being inimical to culture, and was kind of destroying it. And so in reaction to that, I started to get back into to technology again, and I became like the ebook guy, and going to these conferences and yelling at people about like maybe they should not be afraid of the internet because it was quite important. But very specifically, I got fascinated by what was happening to books in that process, as the most kind of physical, dense little embodiments of culture. Like, what does it mean for them to become digital? What does that do to the book? How does it become kind of ephemeralized? Where do our experiences of literature kind of reside when you can't shut the book and put it on a shelf? And there's so much in that bound up in our experience of culture and knowledge and our own experience of it, that the book's just a kind of extraordinary place to study that. But then as you do, you kind of get interested in, well, what happens to literature as well? Like, what happens to the form of that as well? And these become places in which to study the effects of the network. I never even qualify this anymore. When I say the network, I mean like the internet and us, right? Like the complete thing. Like the effect of that on culture and therefore on us. That's just where I was studying it. And because there weren't things to point at, I would start making things like those Wikipedia books. And that slowly got kind of, through various routes, ended up in the art world. The other thing being the project called The New Aesthetic, which was a kind of ongoing sprawling look around at why didn't stuff look new anymore, broadly. That was not particularly an art project, but I was using examples from kind of all over and from technology and technological processes, but turned out to be a term that seemed to be incredibly useful to people in all kinds of fields, particularly in the art world, where it was sort of slightly mistakenly called a movement. But if it became a term that was useful to people, then brilliant. It was just kind of, became one of those. It became a kind of self-fulfilling thing of itself. It was like there was a lacuna in the conversation that it kind of filled. That's why I'm here today. Any more? Happy to break. Oh, one more.
I just wanted to hear the story, if you have a minute, behind finding the first rainbow plane. If you can remember the first time you actually came across it.
No, I can't remember. I spend a lot of time on Google Maps, like a lot. It's kind of the default thing to go out and search for. So yeah, I really can't. The moment I realized what it was when I actually came out of the Drone Shadows project, because there's a weird thing about the Drone Shadows, which is that they're these huge physical full-size installations that take a day to install so that I can photograph them and put a picture of it on the internet, right? Because that's mostly where they get seen, and I'm completely fine with that. So they are precursors to digital images as much as physical installations, which is not uncommon these days. And one thing I tried to do, I did one in Washington, DC a couple of years ago, and I got a satellite picture of DC. It cost about $400 to buy satellite imagery, and even then, it turned out it wasn't actually like high-res enough to be able to pick up my drone shadow. But I thought if I could get a picture of the drone shadow taken by something in low Earth orbit, that would be pretty awesome. But when they deliver you satellite imagery, it comes in this incredibly arcane image format. It's like a kind of super high bitrate TIFF image in different layers. And it turns out those different layers are actually the different the results from the different sensors. So if you calibrate it right, you figure out that one of them is the red layer, and one of them is the green layer, and one of them is the blue layer. But there's also like a layer that's entirely clouds, because they just use a very narrow frequency that doesn't penetrate water. So there's a whole set of satellite imagery that's just pictures of clouds, which I love. But so I had to learn how to process satellite imagery, and it was kind of took not quick all the time, but like in doing that I was like, oh, that's what this is, kind of thing. And that's that's always a lovely process when you're actually kind of materially involved in the thing for whatever kind of ridiculous reasons, and you suddenly realize, oh yeah, that explains that. That's a story. All right. Thank you very much.